Welcome to Critical Issues, Alternative Views. I'm Ron Kramer, Professor of Sociology at Western Michigan University, and I'm the host for our program. Joining me is one of my regular partners in ideological crime, that's Don Cooney. Don is a professor in the School of Social Work at WMU, and Don also serves as the Vice Mayor of the City of Kalamazoo. Joining us today, we have a special guest, David Benac, who is a professor in the History Department at Western Michigan University. He's also an important member of a relatively new group called Organized West Michigan, and he can tell us a little bit more about that group in a bit. And probably most importantly, at this point, David has declared that he's a candidate for the Democratic nomination in the 6th Congressional District here in Michigan. And he's thrown his hat into the ring, and his campaign is ready to take off. So, David, welcome to Critical Issues. Glad to have you on the program. Why don't you take a little bit of time and tell us a bit about yourself? I'm sure there are a number of our members of our viewing audience that don't know too much about you. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? And I think we'd be interested in knowing how you arrived at the decision to run for Congress. That's a pretty important decision. So.
Okay, thank you. And thanks for having me.
Sure.
So my decision to run for Congress has really been very long. It's been a difficult and interesting process. So in my background, I grew up in northern Michigan. I'm originally from Alpena, a small farming community. Mm-hmm. And after leaving there, I went to Michigan State to go to school. Went there, from there to Missouri, or for Indiana, then Missouri to finish up my schooling. Taught in Louisiana for about 10 years. From there, I moved back to Michigan when I had the opportunity to come teach at Western. My activism and my real interest in getting involved in the political process and in what we were talking about beforehand is crimes against nature started a little bit in Missouri, but I really got involved in it in Louisiana. I saw more everyday life, how the effects of different types of actions were harming individual people.
Now, you were there during the time of Katrina, right?
Yeah. Right. So that's I mentioned that the other day. That's really what crystallized my intention to become heavily involved in trying to seek solutions. Is I was living there during Katrina, and the way that disaster unfolded, the way that it affected individuals' lives, it destroyed families, it killed about 1,500 people, it left the city's infrastructure in ruins, it ruined people's homes, it ruined livelihoods, and it was really destructive for mental health of a lot of people in the city. It was a real challenge for rebuilding that community afterwards. One of the things I saw after that made me really aware of what grassroots actions can do, and that's one of the things that really impressed me more than anything else, is after Katrina happened, the city of New Orleans was an absolutely amazing place. It was terrifying. There was death and destruction and armed guards everywhere, but everybody in that community was working so hard to help one another and try to rebuild what it meant to live there. And it was really, for a time, amazing. Like, we're all in this together kind of a thing. So I saw what can happen when community pulls together. Not too long after that, the BP oil well blew up in the Gulf, and all the great things that we'd accomplished in the past few years seemed to be thrown, out the window again, and we had to fight all those things all over again. The fishing industry, which had supported generations of people, is still not returned to where it is, and that's about the time that I moved up to Kalamazoo, to come back to Michigan where I'd grown up, and moved to what then was the advertising slogan of Pure Michigan, and found out I was on the shores of the river where the largest inland oil spill in the United States history had taken place. I moved from the largest offshore oil spill to the largest inland oil spill in the space of a few months. It was like, that to me is like, we really have to do something about this.
Environmental crime seemed to follow you around.
Yeah, yeah.
You're bad luck.
Yeah, a couple people don't move into my neighborhood. Yeah. But so when that happened, it's like, all right, BP in the Gulf, Enbridge here in Kalamazoo, and then the thing just recently with Standing Rock and the Line 5 in Mackinac, and it's just the number of threats that we see on a daily basis, we really need to take action against them. And so that's when, so getting into where the politics come in, is I was really got drawn into the Sanders movement. And so when Sanders declared his candidacy, I became one of the key organizers in this area of the state. And I think it's really amazing that in the primary elections, Sanders won 57% of the Democratic vote. It's the largest percentage of victory he got in the entire state. And that happened because we had great volunteers, we had passion, we made phone calls, we knocked doors, and we organized. That's why it happened. So after he lost the primary and he endorsed Clinton, we went through the process of what's next, and he chose me as one of the 3 people from the state of Michigan to represent his issues on the National Platform Committee. And that was a really amazing thing for me, and I got to see the kind of the inner workings of the party. And one of the things that I saw was that a lot of the party is still in the hands of the corporate interests, and just exactly what Sanders was telling us. And those people were doing the bidding of what the biggest donors were telling them to do. And I couldn't stand by and let that continue to happen. So that's when I started pursuing leadership positions within the party, and I got elected to the vice chair of the Environment Caucus for the Michigan Democratic Party. And we're doing some big things. We've got some great leadership. Our chair for that is Melissa Mays. She is one of the lead activists in the Flint case, and she lives in Flint. She had an eviction notice on her house because a lot of the people in Flint who are protesting what's going on, they're not paying their water bills because they're saying, why should we pay for poison? And so the city taxed the water bills onto their taxes. And if they don't pay it, they get an eviction notice. So there was a recent court case where they said, okay, we're no longer going to evict you, but you still have to pay your water bills. So we've got some great people in the Environment Caucus who are really involved in everything that's going on. And so from there, one of my friends who is a union electrician really pushed me to take the next step. I'd been thinking about it for a long time, and he's the one who pushed me, said, hey, this is the moment, this is the time. And I really believe him. I think that's why I'm running for Congress right now, is because I think right now is a really unique moment in history. We have a level of activism and interest and emotion for change that I don't think we've seen since the early 70s. So if we put somebody out there who offers a dramatic vision and inspires people to take part and volunteer and organize, I think we can make bigger change than we've had an opportunity to do in a very long time. And that's what I think, that's why I'm getting involved, because I think this is the right moment for us to push for some real transformative changes in society.
Yeah, and David, you and I were both over in Chicago last week at the People's Summit, and the message that came through real clear there was people are ready for some significant change, not just around the edges, but significant change. I think it's a wonderful time for you to be running.
So can we credit Donald Trump for this?
I think he helped a lot, didn't he? He really got us going here. I mean, the problems were there before Trump.
Absolutely.
But he crystallized them and made it worse even,
Mm-hmm.
and that just got people out there that weren't there before.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to understand that this issues of corporate power and the environmental crisis, not dealing with climate change as forthrightly as we need to.
Yeah.
These are longstanding problems. They were there before Trump, but I think because Trump coming in with his more extreme positions and just the chaos that he's created has opened up an opportunity for some significant change to work on issues that we should have been working on all along.
Right.
But now with Trump stirring up the pot, it's bringing good people like you out to say we got to work on this. Well.
And also the Sanders campaign's success
Yes,
showed
the Bernie
that people
campaign.
were ready,
Yeah.
ready for something significant.
Yeah.
And it gave us a blueprint for action.
Yes.
You know, Sanders did not win the presidency, but he mobilized people in a way that we haven't seen in a very long time. So
Right.
we now know that it can happen. We now know this is how to make it happen.
Yeah.
People should get a hold of Bernie's book, Our Revolution, right?
Right.
Yeah, right.
Which reviews the campaign and lays out a lot of these issues as you've been describing them. So, let's move on and talk about some of the more specific substantive issues now.
Right.
There's so much going on in the news right now. It was tough for us as we were talking before the show, what are we going to talk about today? And there's so many issues out there. But one of the things that I think demands our attention is the fact that Trump did make the decision to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. So this is the accord that 195 nations in the world gathered together to try to do something about the issue of climate change. Now, I think perhaps it'd be important to sketch out a little background to this. David, you mentioned earlier when we were talking off camera that a lot of the inspiration for what was happening with the climate change issue came from the 1987 Montreal Accord, which
Right.
dealt with the ozone issue. So why don't we start there? Why don't you just tell people a little bit about that? That was such a success story, and then it kind of led on to our efforts to deal with climate change.
Right, so in 1987, the UN decided to take a real strong international leadership role and say that ozone, so all these CFCs and these other gases that we're producing were damaging the ozone layer, and as a result, it was opening a hole that allowed solar radiation to cause cancer. And it was clear, it was well defined, there was no real debate about whether or not that was happening. The UN organized an international meeting, the Montreal Accord, the Montreal Protocol, and in that meeting, the nations of the world decided to stop creating ozone-depleting gases. As a result, there's a direct correlation. The ozone hole is shrinking, causing fewer cases of cancer as a result. And what that did is it gave us a blueprint that was the first time the UN had served in that capacity to organize the nations of the world in a coordinated way to address a global environmental issue.
Was
That's-
that like the refrigerators and the air conditioners,
Right,
Freon
right.
and all that?
Yeah, so it's the propellants in like aerosols and then also
Right.
the coolants. And that's one of the reasons why it was really possible to do it, because none of those propellants or those cooling agents are absolutely crucial to the global economy as we know it. They could all be relatively inexpensively replaced.
Mhm.
So we were able to make good movement on that without major corporate pushback.
But it served as a model
Yeah.
for what we could do. And it's about this time, of course, I think 1988 is sort of the critical year. That was the year Dr. Hansen
Yeah.
made his famous
Yeah.
speech in front of the Senate and basically said, hey, global warming is here, it's happening already. And that was the year that the United Nations created the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So we started getting much more concerted effort on looking at gathering the research on climate change, which had been there for decades prior to that, but now a major push. And then this eventually led to, in 1992, the UN Framework Convention on climate change. Can you talk a little bit about that Framework Convention? Because that sets up then the series of meetings that lead to Paris, right?
Yeah, and just to go a little bit further in terms of developing that context, this is one of the problems that we face today when we try to address climate change, is that it's become a political issue. Climate change and environmental politics in particular, or environmental issues in particular, were not political issues until the 1980s. And if we look back and see who was the president that signed the most, or who signed the most significant environmental legislation into action, it was Nixon.
Yeah.
You know, and
Unbelievable.
certainly not an environmentalist. He did that because that's what the people wanted. And as the representative of the people, he saw that as his job. And then when Reagan came into office, the whole perspective changed. And he began to interpret anything that in any way inhibited the ability of business to make profits or increase the ability of government to regulate as a bad thing for the nation. And all of a sudden, environmental regulations, environmental protections, anything that prevented pollution was seen as an economic non-starter for Republican politicians. At the same time as when Gore started having climate hearings. You know, and you mentioned Hansen. So Gore and Hansen testifying before Congress tied the Democratic politicians and the scientists together as opposed to Reagan's anti-regulatory philosophy. And that's really the point at which we began to think of this as an environmental issue, a political issue, when there's no reason. There should not be a political issue to save the planet that we need in order to live.
Yeah, if you care about that.
Right.
But if you just care about making money, and of course the biggest business in the world right now is still oil,
Right.
and if that's what you care about, then that's secondary. Save the planet.
So yeah, but so then with the 92 agreement, we saw that this was exactly what came to play. You know, so that's the context in which this plays out. Is the United States decides that we don't want to get involved in taking part in a global agreement if it could potentially limit the amount of economic growth we might see in the future, regardless of what it's going to do to the planet. And that's really what came out of the agreement in 92, is that we weren't willing to take that leadership role and say this is a real problem, and as global leaders we're going to tackle it. Instead, we're going to look and see what's the best short-term economic solution for businesses in the United States.
But I just saw some statistics this week that the fallacy of limiting economic growth. It limits certain kinds of economic growth, but already I believe that renewable energy jobs generate 2.8 times as much jobs as does the extractive gas and oil things, and worldwide it's like 5 to 1. So it would kick up economic growth for some, but take it away from people that already got power right now.
Right, that's absolutely true.
So the Framework Convention of 92 set up a process, a political process, whereby every year the nations of the world would gather in what was called a conference of parties, and usually toward the end of the year, and attempt to put together some kind of a broad international agreement to deal with the issue of climate change. And year after year after year, we seem to be spinning our wheels and not making very much headway. Although in 1997, the Kyoto Agreement was reached, so that was the first step. It was a rather weak and limited kind of an agreement. But even that agreement, so Bill Clinton, as he was leaving the presidency, signed the Kyoto Agreement. But as soon as George W. Bush came into office, he rescinded that signature. Clinton had not submitted the treaty to Congress, to the Senate, which needed to ratify it. He knew that Republican opposition was so strong it wouldn't pass. Of course, once Bush withdrew our signature, it was a moot point. So Kyoto went ahead without the United States involvement. And as you say, the U.S. has been one of the main obstacles all along the way. Now in 2009, the first year that Barack Obama was the president, there was the Conference of Parties in Copenhagen, and there was a lot of hope that this was going to be the time. Okay, George W. Bush, his administration had blocked any effort to deal with climate change for 8 years, but now with the new president who recognized that climate change was an issue, we were hoping that there would be some movement, but there wasn't. Again, Copenhagen ended up to be in failure. One British environmentalist said, Copenhagen is a crime scene tonight. The guilty parties are fleeing to the airport. There's no agreement. And there wasn't. Now, China was an obstacle, but the U.S. was an obstacle as well. So this contentious political process continued. And so finally, enough momentum had been generated that it seemed clear that in 2015, when the Conference of Parties was going to be in Paris, that there might be a chance to finally have a breakthrough agreement. And in September of 2014, if you remember, there was a meeting at the United Nations in which they were preparing to go to Paris, and that's when the environmental groups organized a massive rally, the march. There was a climate justice march in Midtown Manhattan. 400,000 people. I was there, 400,000 of my closest friends, marching through the streets of Manhattan. And the next day to march to the United Nations to try to put pressure on. Well, moving ahead then in 2015 in Paris, the world did come up with an agreement. It's not the strongest agreement. It's not what many environmental activists had hoped for, but at least it was a significant accomplishment that we finally had some kind of an agreement. Now, it wasn't billed as a treaty. The United States insisted on that. The Obama administration knew that if it was a treaty, it would have to go to the Senate for ratification. That wouldn't happen, given the Republican control. By then, climate change had become an intensely partisan political issue, unfortunately, in the United States. But we did sign on to the Paris Agreement. Only two countries did not sign on: Syria, in the midst of its devastating civil war, and Nicaragua, because they felt it didn't go far enough. But 195 nations did sign it. It's a voluntary agreement. I think it's important to point that out, right? Each country has its nationally intended targets for how much it's going to reduce its emissions. The U.S. agreed to reduce its emissions 26 to 28% from its 2005 levels. The Clean Power Plan that the Obama administration had created was going to be the centerpiece of that effort to reduce our emissions. And so again, all the countries of the world are voluntarily agreeing to, create plans. And so it's not a binding agreement in that sense. But of course, then we get the election of Donald Trump, right? And Trump had sided with the climate change deniers, had called climate change a hoax, had said that he was going to withdraw the U.S. from the Paris Agreement. Once he became president, he started to appoint climate deniers to a number of cabinet positions, including Scott Pruitt at the Environmental Protection Agency, that agency that Richard Nixon signed into law back in the early 1970s. And so people were kind of waiting, well, is Trump going to do this or not? And of course, he drags it out and makes it a big show. And of course, he intended to do it all along. And so he finally announces that he is going to withdraw us from the Paris Accord. Now, I just wanted to review some of the commentary that came out after this decision. So, I mean, the decision was just absolutely savaged by commentators, even on some of them on the Republican side, clearly across the world. There
are even some corporations.
Many.
Even some fossil fuel corporations said that this was the wrong thing to do.
ExxonMobil was one that said, "Don't do this. Don't do this. Stay in the agreement. We need to have a seat at the table, right? We need to still be a part of this broader political process." But here's how some people savaged the agreement: stupid, reckless, reprehensible, grossly immoral, an international disgrace. One of the most ignorant and dangerous actions ever taken by a president, an inexplicable abdication of any semblance of responsibility or leadership that makes it inevitable that history books will view Trump as America's worst ever president. And being the criminologist, I also know a lot of people said that this is a crime against humanity, a crime against the future of people on the planet. And so, again, this was met with almost universal disdain. And what was amazing to me was that at the press conference that Trump gave to announce this decision, he laid out a whole bunch of reasons, but almost every single thing he said was just absolutely and completely wrong. He totally mischaracterized the agreement, and almost everything he said about its effects were just absolutely and completely wrong, which is not surprising for this president, because almost everything he says is either a deliberate lie or clearly an absolute distortion. He seems very delusional about many things, and climate change is one of those. So, David, what's your take on the Trump decision here?
Well, it's terrible. I really liked I think it was the last quote you used, and I think it's an abdication of our responsibility. What we think about it, the way Americans tend to think about climate change, as I see it, is that it's something that is going to happen at some time in the future, and we don't really know what it's going to do. So we'll figure it out when we need to. That's a really awful perspective, because it is happening now, and I think that is really what people fail to see. If you look at nations like the Maldives, the islands, they're just about gone, because sea level rise is already happening and is destroying people's lives all around the world. If you look at in Africa right now, there is a famine that's fueled by drought, which is fueled by climate change, that is 20 million people are suffering as a result of that. And that is absolutely a byproduct of climate change.
Yeah.
So if you look, even like I started off, I talked about Katrina, you know, so hurricanes get the energy that fuels them from the warm water of the oceans. I just read something that there's a new study that came out in a peer-reviewed journal this year that scientists have now discovered that the oceans are warming at 13% faster rate than what we had previously thought. So that is also devastating to marine life, which has a very tight window where it can survive. It's bleaching corals, which are the basic building block of a lot of our oceans. And it's not just for the marine life. There's people all over the world depend upon that marine life for their food and their livelihoods. So that's going to cause much bigger and more frequent hurricanes slamming into our shores and the shores of nations all around the world. Because the worst effects of climate change are mostly being felt in developed nations.
Yeah.
They're not really being felt most directly by people in the United States. It's easy for us to ignore those effects and to think that they're not real or they're happening maybe sometime in the future. But we have to open our eyes and see this is a global problem, and it's going to require a global solution. The United States has seen itself and been seen by the rest of the world as the leader of the global community since the end of World War II. And by us abdicating our responsibility in this case, we are really, I think, taking an action that is absolutely immoral.
Yeah, and as you say, this is already causing enormous, but it's not causing that great damage here, except for the storms.
Right.
The storms we can see already that's starting to affect us, and the acidic oceans and what it's doing to fishing and things like that. But these other countries, I mean, four I guess it's I wrote them down: Sudan, Yemen, Nigeria, and Somalia. 22 million people facing starvation. But American people say, well, that's them, that's not us. But it's coming quick here.
So we're advocating our global leadership.
Yes.
We don't have a seat at the table, or we won't when this process plays out. And it's not an immediate process, but it'll take a couple of years. But we're abdicating our global responsibility to participate here. And Trump also tried to make the argument that this was going to be economically damaging to the United States. And Don, I want to come back to the point you made. All the evidence seems to suggest that, in fact, if we would participate and move more strongly toward renewable energy sources, that it would be economically beneficial to the United States.
Yeah. And China now is moving in and taking leadership on that and making it extremely difficult for us ever to catch up.
So Trump wants to make America great again, but he's taken an action here that puts America in a very disadvantageous position, both politically but also economically. This is going to have tremendous economic harm.
Right.
And so Trump talks about creating new jobs, but he's just taken an action that's going to take us out of a position to create a number of jobs in renewable energy.
And it fundamentally weakens our global position as well, because by remaining a fossil fuel consuming nation, it puts us at the whim of a lot of nations all over the world, and we have to be dependent upon them for sources of our energy, where if we did this with renewable, clean, green energy, all of that is right here, so we can become much more nationally independent.
So it really comes down to which side are you on. If you're, the kind of jobs you're talking about are going to ordinary people. But the kind of jobs that he's talking about losing are jobs in the oil and gas industry. And I think it's really significant how he's played up to Saudi Arabia, the leading oil exporting country in the world, and his favoritism towards Russia, which he hasn't been able to exploit as much as he wants because of all the surrounding things around the election. But those two, they're the leading exporters of oil in the world, oil and gas in the world.
Right.
And that's who he wants to align himself. And he's distancing himself from the European nations and the other nations that are trying to work toward a whole different kind of model.
It's mind-boggling, the damage that could be done by this. But if there's any kind of silver lining out of the withdrawal and the reaction to it is that other nations have said, hey, we're not giving up. We're going to
Yes.
step up. And so, so Angela Merkel and others in the European Union say they're going to step up, and China is going to continue on. And what's also been encouraging is how a number of U.S. states have responded, California in particular.
Yeah.
I mean, the People's Republic of California may become a reality here before too long,
Yeah.
right? But California and Jerry Brown have taken a very strong leadership role here. And, we had a rally here in Kalamazoo on Wednesday to talk about this problem of the U.S. withdrawing from Paris. And what was very encouraging were the number of local leaders who were there. David, you spoke, but we had county commissioners and city commissioners and others coming forward to outline what's being done at the local level.
Right.
And Don,
Right.
maybe you want to just take a minute
Well,
and talk about the city
yeah,
has been stepping forward on this.
the
Aaron
city-
Knott was there to talk on Wednesday, but the city's got a plan to move forward.
We do. Paul Clements had a class who spent the whole semester saying, okay, what were the significant steps that we could take to combat climate change in the city? And they came out with a 26-page report, which we are taking as a blueprint for how to move forward in this whole area. And we've committed ourselves to do everything we can to make the Paris Agreement live right here. So we're on board with that very, very much.
And so that's what I wanted. It's one of the great things we're seeing is cities, not just
Yeah,
mayors,
right.
or sorry, not just governors and states,
Yeah.
but there's a lot of cities that have signed on to say that they're going to do everything they can to support.
National Council of Mayors has come out really strong in that area, and we're pulling together all the cities to try to say, no, we can understand what this does to our people, and we're going to do everything we can to combat it.
So again, we've had devastation, and to draw an analogy from your experience in New Orleans, the devastation of Hurricane Katrina, people responded by pulling together and trying to fight back and to rebuild. And I sense the same kind of thing. Trump has just withdrawn us from the Paris Agreement. That's a devastating move, but we see the rallying, the resistance, and the development of cities and states and other nations responding. So hopefully that resistance, the climate resistance, will only continue to grow.
Yeah, I think one of the significant things is that we are relying on the expertise of you folks who have done so much on campus with your climate change study group, which has gone so deeply into what we can do and what's out there. So the alignment between the city and relating to you folks has just been really great, and I think that's wonderful to see that.
And just following up on that, it's not just campus, not just the city. There are grassroots progressive organizations all over the state that I'm tied to that are taking this on.
That's
There's,
great.
Progressive United groups. There's Pro-Kazoo here in Kalamazoo. There's a whole host of indivisible groups. There's Our Revolution. There's all these groups all over the state that are forming to mobilize people, and not just for climate change, but for all of for climate change and all these other really important progressive issues that we need to face.
Okay.
Well, I know that we will come back to this issue again and again. Climate change has been an issue that we've addressed on this program repeatedly, and we will continue to do so. Let me shift over to another topic. There's just so much going on in the news, but I think we should probably talk just a little bit about what's happening with the ongoing investigation. So this starts off as an investigation into Russia's attempt to perhaps interfere with the U.S. election, and has now morphed into a much broader kind of investigation. It led to the firing of the FBI director, James Comey, and then Comey most recently was invited to address the Senate Intelligence Committee, so he gave what seemed to be a pretty damning testimony a week or so ago. And the special counsel, Robert Mueller's investigation continues. And now we had a story in the Washington Post and New York Times this week that the Mueller investigation is now focusing on Trump himself and whether he has engaged in the crime of obstruction of justice, which, just, I mean, Trump seems to have confessed to this crime on national television on several occasions, including his interview with Lester Holt. But Mueller now is focusing his investigation in a number of different areas, but one of them is whether Trump himself has engaged in obstruction of justice. So, David, your take on what's happening with the Mueller investigation, the Comey testimony, and where this might lead us in the near future?
Well, this is a really tough subject because we have to let the process play out fully. I mean, they have to do real investigation, look for real evidence. And in this particular case, it seems like the evidence is just absolutely difficult to uncover, other than some of Trump's own statements, and it's very difficult to understand the context in which he speaks quite often. But if there is anything to this, and if we do get to a point where obstruction of justice is proved, that would fall in, there's very few outlinable or very few well-defined grounds for impeachment. And the main thing is the term called high crimes and misdemeanors, which today that seems very loose and undefined for most Americans, but it was a very clearly understood concept at the time of the writing of the Constitution. And the kind of the catch-all, it meant abuse of power, whether it was bribery or nepotism or putting unfit people in office or whatever it was. It's a catch-all term that just really means abuse of power. So if there is anything behind this that leads to obstruction of justice charges, I believe that would be grounds for impeachment, but we'll have to wait and see what the investigations discover.
Well, one of the things that strikes me is how he goes after other people. Rod Rosenstein now is the latest one. Here's this guy who had an impeccable record before, and now Trump turns on him and says, here's the guy that told me to fire, as if Rosenstein had the power to tell the president what to do. And now he's blaming Rosenstein, says he's now investigating me for obstruction of justice. He told me to fire this guy, as if that was up to him. So that's one thing. Here's the thing that gets me. I think it's really significant that Jared Kushner's being investigated.
Sure.
Because I've heard a number of people say that the real issue is with the Russian banks. That I don't know this, but I remember, I can't think of the guy's name, was a law professor at Columbia University, who said that that the Russian banks, after Trump lost all his casinos in Atlantic City, was very much strapped for money, and the only ones who would loan him money were the Russian banks.
Yes.
And that he owes a lot of money to the Russian banks. And this law professor was saying this is going to come out and this is going to be his undoing.
That could very well be, because I know I read an article in The Atlantic that pointed out, when he was on the campaign trail, Trump was railing against Goldman Sachs. Although he's put Goldman Sachs in power in his cabinet, because Goldman Sachs wouldn't loan him money.
Right.
Because Goldman Sachs considered him to be too much of a risk.
Yeah.
So he did have to look for loans from other sources.
Mm-hmm. Well, just this morning there was another report that the Mueller special counsel investigation is also now looking into a lot of these financial ties.
Right.
And so, again, we do have to wait and see where this investigation goes. But the issue now to me is that the special counsel investigation is exploring a number of very serious charges. And any number of these charges, if founded, if there's evidence to support them, could result in the political decision. Now, we have to make clear that impeachment is a political decision. It's not necessarily a legal proceeding. The president probably cannot be charged with criminal activity in these cases, but the special counsel's investigation could demonstrate that serious actions had been taken that did violate the law, that rise to the level of high crimes and misdemeanors, and so a political decision would have to be made at that point by the Congress. Now, the question is, the Republicans control the House of Representatives, they control the Senate. Would they, in fact, decide that enough is enough? Would enough Republicans in the House of Representatives vote to impeach the president, which is basically to initiate the charges, and then there would have to be a trial in the Senate, and would enough Republican senators vote to convict on the impeachment charges? So those are some questions that I think linger out there.
Yeah.
You have to go back to Nixon.
Yeah.
Because Nixon, he resigned
Yeah,
because the
he would've
Republican
been.
leadership, which controlled Congress, came to him and said, "We will impeach you if you don't
Yes.
resign."
Right.
So, for whatever you might make of the administration that was there at that time and the representatives saw that there was a problem, it needed to be addressed, and they took the leadership role and told the president that they were going to do what they were supposed to do. Do we have that leadership in Congress now,
Well-
that if the charges are proved to have merit, would they stand up and take a leadership role and do what they're supposed to?
If there's incontrovertible evidence, they got their eye on the next election. And if they stand with Trump when there's enormous evidence that he is guilty, they're going to pay a terrible price in the upcoming election, and they know that. So I think they always have to consider, this guy is really where we want him. He's going to sign anything we put before him. But can we risk this other, I don't know. If he fires Mueller, what's going to happen?
Well, that's the other issue I was just going to bring up, is that what's still a wild card, I think, in this situation is whether or not Trump, as volatile as he is and as rash as he is in his decision-making, would also attempt to fire this special counsel.
Right.
He's already demonstrated that he would, he's fired Sally Yates, he fired Comey,
Yeah.
and he's been angry at Rod Rosenstein,
Yeah.
the Deputy Attorney General, who had to, because of Attorney General Sessions' recusal, it was up to the Deputy Attorney General who made the decision to appoint the special counsel. And so something came out this week to the effect that Trump was considering now trying to fire Mueller, the special counsel.
Yeah.
Now, to do that, of course, he has to basically tell Rosenstein to do it. And Rosenstein can only do it if there's a finding of cause. You can't just dismiss the special counsel without cause. Rosenstein has already said this week, at this point, there's no cause to dismiss him, and I won't do it. So Trump would have to fire Rosenstein, and we're back to
Which is
Saturday
actually
Night
what-
Massacre,
Saturday Night
right?
exactly what
Massacre,
happened.
right?
And
Yeah.
so Nixon had to go through several layers of
Three.
people in the Justice Department to find somebody, Robert Bork, who would carry out the dismissal of the special prosecutor in that case. If that happens, how does that affect the political dynamic? Does that seems to be such an outrageous action that
Yeah.
it might even swing some of the Republicans in
Yeah.
Congress who are still supporting the president to the other side. Would that be your reading, or?
It's really difficult to predict what's going to happen with either this administration or this Congress. So I really don't know that I could say, but yes, if he fires Mueller, goes through the process to have Mueller fired, I think that has to push the impeachment process into motion.
Ordinarily, I would be very upset that all this dealings with the special prosecutor, with Comey, we're not getting any of the work done that needs to be done around health care and infrastructure. But
Right.
with this president, I'm very glad he's distracted and he doesn't have time to deal with these issues, because the way he would deal with them is not the way that would help the country. So,
All right, so we have to kind of sit back and wait and see how this plays out. Number one, the Mueller investigation has to go forward. And number two, what's Trump going to do? Is he going to try to interfere in that process, which would be only another level of obstruction of justice if he tried to do that? Don, I know that you're concerned about the health care issue greatly,
Yeah.
and that this is one of those issues that's still percolating. While all this other stuff's going on, the Senate, the Republicans in the Senate, a small group of Republicans in the
Exactly.
Senate, are meeting at a secret undisclosed location in some cave underneath the Capitol and hammering out a new health care bill. So what's happening there?
well, that's the way we make these bills these days now. We don't let anybody know what's in them, even people in our own party who are going to have to vote on this. And apparently there will be no hearings. There are no public testimony. They're just going to try to ram this thing through. And from all reports that we know, it will undo all the advantages to Medicaid that the Obama administration had put in place. And millions of people will lose their health care under this plan. And it will make it extremely difficult for many, many people to be able to afford health care. And the only ones who will benefit will be the richest people in the country who will get enormous tax breaks through this. So this is totally, for me, it's as bad as the Paris Peace Accords, walking away from that because of the damage that it's going to do to ordinary people in this country. So I don't think we can let this happen and just watch it happen. I think we have to take strong stands and say, no, we know the kind of health care we need in this country. And all the polls show that people are ready for a single-payer kind of a health care, a Medicare for all, because that would save the country enormous amounts of money. Everybody would be in, nobody out. That's what we want, not this big step back from what they're going to be proposing, and that they hope to push through in the next week and a half before the 4th of July.
David, your take on what's happening with the Republicans in the Senate on the health care issue?
Well, under the plan that they're debating, 40,000 people in our congressional district would lose health care.
40,000.
40,000 just in our district. That doesn't count the state. So those are the people in our communities, in our neighborhoods, our friends and family. This is again, it's kind of like going back to the climate change. We're not talking about something in the future. We're not talking about something somewhere else. It's going to hit us here.
Yeah.
It's going to hit us here soon. And like Don said, this is a transfer of wealth. This is taking money out of the pockets of people who work the hardest in society in order to give tax breaks to the most wealthy. And the only real thing that we can do is fight to make sure that this doesn't happen, because of all the problems that might exist with Medicare for all, with the ACA, it's the best thing we have. And the next step is to protect that and get to Medicare for all, so that everybody's covered, everybody has access, and everybody's treated equally.
So, Don, your take on what's happening with the bill that the Senate Republicans are developing. Will they be able, because remember, it only takes 50 votes, basically, right? To pass this. It's going to be filibuster proof, right? Mm-hmm. The way they're designing it. Are they going to be able to bring enough Republicans along? Is Susan Collins going to support this?
Bob Corker.
Lindsey Graham, are they going to be able to get a united Republican front, because they can only afford to lose 2 or 3 people, right?
Right.
For this to go down. Are they going to be able to do that? That's one question. The second question is this going to be significantly different from the House bill that would cause the Freedom Caucus in the House to balk at what the Senate Republicans are constructing here?
You know, it's hard to tell when nobody can see the bill, but what we know...
It's still down in that dark, deep cave, right?
Yeah. What we know of it from all the reports that come out is, in the beginning they said, well, the House bill is dead. But as they began to deliberate, it seems like they've moved very much closer to that, with a couple of artificial adjustments. One of them would be that one of the key things that they intend to do, apparently, is cut the subsidy that the government is giving for new people moving into Medicaid, so that the government was supporting any new people on Medicaid at 90% of the cost. They want to remove that. They want to take that away for anybody else coming on. So one of the things that they're proposing is we won't do that right away. We'll delay it a couple years, or we'll phase it out. But the ultimate effect is going to be that millions of people are going to lose their health care. So I think it's really important that these people take a look at this. Now, Bob Corker has said, I don't like all this deliberations in secret. I don't believe that's the way you do a bill. So I don't know. I think it's really important also to realize that the House bill wouldn't have passed except for our congressman. Congressman Upton owns that bill. And as we debate what's going to go on in healthcare, we have to look to our congressman to say, that's why we want you up there, Dave, so that this doesn't happen again. I would guess that it wouldn't pass the Senate. That's my guess. I don't believe that those 3 people, and maybe more, will vote for that.
Lisa Murkowski from Alaska would be another possible
and then the
defection.
woman from Maine.
Susan Collins.
Susan Collins from Maine.
Yeah.
So I'm hopeful. But it will, unless people scream I believe they could get it through. They're going to try to ram it through real quick.
Yeah, that to me is the outrageous thing, that they're attempting to ram this through in the dark of night,
Right.
not allowing any public hearings on the bill. I mean, this is a significant and important bill. This affects a large portion of our economy. It affects thousands, millions of people in their daily lives. And so to rush this through in the dark of night, not allowing any discussion or debate or public hearings seems just to be an outrageous political travesty.
The United States is spending almost $3 trillion a year on health care. So this is enormously significant, what we're going to do with this bill.
So David, as you think ahead to a campaign in 2018,
Correct.
Presumably against Fred Upton, but we don't know if he's going to be the nominee on the Republican side. There's some rumors that he might be seeking some other office, right? But how are you going to focus, or are you going to focus on the health care as a significant issue in your campaign, and what kind of a message do you want to bring to the voters of the 6th Congressional District?
So what we were saying, the ACA has some problems, right? But there is no excuse whatsoever to get rid of it. It is simply, like we mentioned, it's a transfer of wealth. That's the only reason that anyone wants to get rid of this. And we have, last I saw, 1% of the population in the United States owns more than the bottom 90%. And all that this does is make that worse. And in the process, throws so many people off of their health care. So we absolutely have to protect the ACA. But my perspective is we need Medicare for all. There is no way around that. We need to fight for Medicare for all. It's what most Americans want. It's not reinventing the wheel. It's a system we already have, and it is the system that's the most equitable for everyone.
You
can support that.
I think I'm right in your corner on that one, David. Yes. And I think it's really important to realize they act, even the commentators act like, well, we couldn't do Medicare for all. That'll never pass. But all the polls show the exact opposite.
Right.
People think, overwhelmingly, people believe that the government should ensure that everybody has access to health care. That's clear. So we're right on target with fighting for that.
Yep. It's people say that that's a radical perspective. It's not radical.
radical
It's exactly what most Americans want.
Right.
It's what most of the world has.
Exactly.
I mean, we're the outlier here. Yeah. We're the one that's the deviant in this case in the international community. Almost every other nation in the world has some kind of national health insurance system that covers all people.
And pays half of what we're paying with everybody to be covered.
Yeah.
And has better health outcomes.
Better health outcomes.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we just have a couple of minutes left. David, we've talked about a number of issues today. Are there other issues that you want to make front and center as you advance your campaign for Congress next year?
There's a lot of different things that I really hope to address at the very front and very forcefully. What they almost all of them come down to is the inequities, the way that the very system is rigged against us, whether it is in education, where the things that DeVos is doing, trying to take money away from public schools and send it to privates. We need to do everything we can to invest in the best possible forward-thinking, modern public school system so that every single person in this country has access to a great education. If we can do that, then that's going to change a lot of the inequalities at the very start of life and going to make people much more able to succeed at every level. We need to look at other things like the private prison system. We need to get rid of the private prison system.
Yep.
All that does is create incentives for the court systems in the states to throw people into prison. If we have a profit motive to imprison our population, that's morally wrong and it's just bad justice system. Mm-hmm. So we need to look at where all these different problems are. We need to find ways to create jobs. We need to really carefully talk about and figure out how we're going to address the issue of automation. We're losing more jobs in this country to automation than we are to anything else. It's not offshoring or it's not the closing of business just because of taxes. It's automation, and that's a really difficult thing to deal with. But we have to get innovative and creative as a nation and come up with some big solutions so that businesses can still make profits, but people will have good quality jobs that can allow them to live a comfortable life.
So you see that there's a positive, responsible role for government to play in improving the lives of American citizens.
Some people might not agree, but we do have to do that.
That seems to be sort of an alien concept anymore among some people. So David, if people would like to get involved in your campaign, is there a website? Is
Yeah,
there a way they can contact you?
You can, benacforcongress.com is the website. On Facebook, it's Benac for Congress. On Twitter, it's David_Benac. I forget what it is on YouTube, but I'm there too. So get on any of them, and they'll all link to one another. And I really hope to hear from you, and hope to be earning your support.
All right. Well, David, thank you very much for being our guest today. Hopefully we'll have you back on the program again in the future.
Thanks, Dave.
I wanted to just also announce that Denise Keel, professor of political science at Western, has agreed to become a regular member on critical issues when she returns from her sabbatical in September. So we're anxious to have Denise join us as a team. And there's no shortage of critical issues for us to cover. I hope we always do so by developing an alternative perspective, a more progressive critical vision for where our country can go. I think that's the heart of your campaign, David, as well. And so we thank you for joining us, and we invite you to come back to see us again on Critical Issues, Alternative Views.